Rachelle is an assistant professor in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at UVM, also a Gunn Fellow. Her work centers on cultural ecosystem services, which I think she'll talk a little bit more about. Also environmental education, environmental values broadly, and behaviors connected to those values. So the next talk is by Rachelle, and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Taylor. And I'm really honored to be part of this panel and to hear what everyone has to say. So thank you. So today, as Taylor introduced a little bit, I'm going to talk about cultural ecosystem services and the bigger area of which that's a part. So I'm going to summarize a paper that I recently published with co-authors. This is the title, and it highlights emerging what we called frontiers in the study of ecosystem services that have the potential to advance equity and inclusion. So given that ecosystem services is a fairly common concept in conservation and environmental decision-making, we're summarizing how that field is moving toward greater equity. And there's an element of the paper also that's simultaneously encouraging those nascent movements. So I want to start by defining ecosystem services. So if I were in the room, I would ask how many of you have heard of this concept. Curious also how many of you dislike the concept. It's quite a controversial concept, so there would probably be some of you in that category. And what might interest you, of those of you unenthused about this concept, is that many of the trends I'm going to describe are helping to address some of the biggest critiques of ecosystem services, I think. And so very briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept, what are they? The basic concept of ecosystem services is that nature benefits people. Ecosystems benefit human well-being, and that's the service. They're providing services to people. So for about 15 years, the field has been using this three-part designation of ecosystem services, these three different ways that ecosystems benefit us. Provisioning and regulating, as you can see there with examples, the physical ways ecosystems benefit us. And then the cultural ecosystem services, that's the part that I focus on, can be thought of as the non-material ways that ecosystems benefit us. So these are things like spiritual connections, recreational, identity-based, heritage-based, the ones that are measured in very different ways. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So this is the paper that I'll be discussing, and I want to quickly mention that it's not new content. We're really summarizing what we see as trends in the field, and it's one distillation of those trends with a particular focus on those that are moving the field towards more equity and justice, more attention to those issues. I have three co-authors on this paper. Leah Bremer has been working in ecosystem services largely in Hawaii and in Latin America for over a decade. Kelly Meza Prado worked for the Natural Capital Project and is from the Colombian Andes. She's back there now. And Pua'ala Pasqua is a native Hawaiian scholar I'll talk about her work in a little bit. So all of these trends relate to equity and inclusivity in environmental valuation, by which I mean the way we figure out why nature matters and how we should act on that value that nature has. So this statement is sort of the centerpiece, one of the centerpieces of my research. It's that the methods that we use limit the types of values we can include and relatedly whose values we can include. So a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about is talking about expanding methods so that we can do a better job of bringing more people and more types of value into the discussion. Recognitional and procedural justice are really core here. So recognizing diversity of viewpoints and relationships with ecosystems, and then how we do this valuation. And then empowering communities by things like co-creating tools and making space for new ways of expression. So I'm just going to quickly mention the frontiers and then give you a couple of examples. The first one is to broaden definitions and concepts of non-material values. So this means beyond services, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, beyond instrumental values. So this idea that nature exists to benefit us, that's sort of means to an end thinking, and beyond the kinds of values like recreation and aesthetics that are arguably easy to measure, but maybe more superficial in some cases. The second theme is to address collective aspects of non-material values and to attend to process. These are really connected. So this is a basic issue in social science. Do we look at the individual level or the collective level? How do those two interact? So there are multiple developments like this field of social and shared values, and then really a lot of attention to procedure, process, how are we understanding these values, who's involved, et cetera. The third theme is acknowledging that non-material values are reciprocal, relational, and dynamic. So a lot here, a lot to say about each of those words. The reciprocal word coming back to this idea of beyond services that ecosystems are providing us. So this idea that there are two arrows, there's another arrow in that diagram I showed from people back to ecosystems. How is that happening? That we're providing services to ecosystems. This idea of relational values I've helped to develop, which is that we really need to attend to the relationships between different groups and that these values are dynamic. I'm not going to talk too much about that. Fourth theme is that there's embracing of narrative and other qualitative evidence. So my inspiration for this that I do in my own work as part of the field is critical race theory and other fields that really foreground justice, the power of narrative to talk about some of these justice related issues. And then any tradition that is orally based, this is going to be just super central and crucial. And then the last one is to better connect to biophysical details. So to look at the nuance in both the social and biophysical dimensions. So this is really squarely at the interdisciplinary part of this field, is doing a better job of being rich in both sides. We've kind of veered off and gotten detailed on the social side and missed some of the details on the ecological side. So better connecting to the biophysical. And for some values in communities, foraging, for instance, any sort of collecting, harvesting, this is very crucial. You can't collect an item if it's biophysically not, if it's different. So here are the 5 themes, and just in a couple of minutes, I'm going to give you just a few examples of what this looks like. So this is Puala Pasco's work, a little March picture for you. She worked on Hawaii Island, a couple of workshops to ask what are the non-material relationships and benefits with ecosystems. So she created this beautiful typology. I don't expect you to read this. The point is it's very detailed. And then I'm going to show you just one. So I'm going to take one of the 4 categories is mana, which means spirituality. And then within that category, there are 6 different subcategories. So here's one of them, Ho'omana Mauli'ola, which is that spiritual beliefs and practices that allow people to interact with the mana of a landscape. So that's a benefit that was identified through this process. And then here's an example of indicators. On the right is indicators of that. How might we tell if that's happening? So very powerful. There's a ton here. And this is broadening definitions and concepts. So definitely beyond that unidirectional service. It was collectively generated and looking at collective values, and it's acknowledging reciprocity. Super quickly, this is a website of a proud supplier of ecosystem services. So this is associated with Upstream Payments for Ecosystem Services project. And it's highlighting the people who are providing those services and telling their stories. And so on this website, you have pretty detailed stories, narratives of people who are really involved in ecosystem services projects and what they mean to them. So this is acknowledging those relationships. It's embracing narrative because it's telling people's stories. And it's better connecting to biophysical details because these people are extremely knowledgeable about the biophysics of the services that they're providing, quote unquote, in ecosystem services language. So I'll end there. These are the 5 frontiers we discussed, and I think I am right at 8 minutes. So thank you so much.
Great. Okay. That was fantastic. Quick reminder, questions for Rachelle in the chat or the Q&A function. I have one while we wait for others to come in. Clearly, as you said at the beginning, ecosystem services has a long way to go. I just wondered in your sort of perspective, if the idea of ecosystem services overall, as it has sort of arrived and developed, has helped bring a focus to beneficiaries and who they are and the idea of equitable distribution and justice and equity in environmental issues, or has it pulled us away from those topics? Like, even if that is a long way to go, has it pulled us toward where we want to go, or been neutral, or actually exacerbated the problem?
Well, I'd love to hear Jesse. I feel like Jesse's work addresses this also. So I hope that we can look at it from a very different angle, and maybe more looking at distributional impacts. So this work is harder to connect to distributional impacts, but I think it depends. My answer is it depends on what we mean by ecosystem services, because this is part of what we see when we look at like there's hundreds of papers that deal with cultural ecosystem services. And some of them are very different than what a lot of people think of when they think of ecosystem services. So these sort of, it depends on how you're defining that concept. And I think some of the things that we describe in that paper, for instance, I think are really moving towards a much more holistic, multifaceted description of human nature relationships that I think move us towards that, where we want to go, at least in my normative world. Where we want to go. And then I think there are some versions of ecosystem services that take us away from having that more holistic understanding.